Here with me now is Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Thank you for coming in. It's nice to see you. We are less than 7 days now from a potential government shutdown. How seriously is the Biden administration taking that possibility?
Well, look, this is something that can and should be prevented. So the administration, as always, will be ready for anything. But look, Speaker McCarthy and the president made a deal. They made a deal earlier this summer. And by the way, it wasn't an easy deal. I mean, just from the transportation side alone, it meant us accepting cuts that Republicans were demanding to programs that we wanted to use to fund more roads and bridges and airports. But we made that deal, and all we're asking is that they live up to that deal. A shutdown would include, just in the transportation side alone, shutting down air traffic control training at the exact moment when the country recognizes the need for more, not less, ATC staffing, and when we finally got cancellations back at or below normal rates. That's just one example of a shutdown that would mean service members wouldn't get paid. Coming back to transportation, the air traffic controllers who would be working in the towers, they wouldn't get paid. They're under enough stress as it is doing that job without having to come into work with the added stress of not receiving a paycheck. So the American people don't want to shut down. From what I can tell, the Senate is ready to go. The administration is ready to go. House Republicans need to come to their senses and keep the government running.
You talk about what would happen when it comes to air traffic controller, the training, those who are being trained and also those who are actually working now. But what would it mean for passengers?
Well, look, one thing that we have been through a lot of is disruptions, right? Those disruptions are largely caused by the weather, but sometimes it can be because of staffing issues. That's exactly what we're trying to grow the workforce. This would stop us in our tracks. In January, there was an outage of a critical IT system that the FAA has been working to modernize. A shutdown would slow down our progress modernizing technology at the exact moment when we need to do it. And again, I'm just giving you some examples out of the transportation space across the country. So many impacts would be felt. This has to be avoided.
You mentioned the deal that the president and the House Speaker cut a few months ago. Have they spoken about this crisis right now?
I don't know the latest time that they've spoken, but I think the president's position is very clear. And by the way, there's also been a dialogue going on about making sure that there's measures to keep the government open that have things like disaster relief in them, that have things like support for the FAA to be able to get through some of these issues that the FAA is facing. By the way, you mentioned passengers. Another thing that grinds to a halt in the event of a shutdown is the work that we've been doing to have rules that get passengers refunds when they get delays. So I think a lot of times, sometimes in the rhetoric in Washington, anything that isn't the military gets talked about as if it's just faceless, meaningless bureaucracy. We're talking about real work that protects Americans, everything from food safety inspections to the rules that we're working on to hold airlines accountable. We have all of these parts of the government for a reason, and Americans expect Congress to keep that up and running and keep the lights on.
And you mentioned that there's some daycare centers like
Absolutely,
yours
yeah,
that are going to close.
To take just one example that hits pretty close to home for our household, but more importantly for people across the country, and that whether we're talking about federal workers or just people who, parents who are depending on WIC benefits might be waitlisted instead of being able to support their kids. And I would add, the shutdown is being used by some House Republicans as leverage to get budget cuts over and above the deal that was made, which would also have an incredibly negative effect on
They didn't like the deal in the first place.
Yeah, but think about what this means for transportation. Again, obviously I'm speaking mostly to what's in my lane, but some of the very same House Republicans who were lining up to try to make a partisan political issue of air travel disruptions are proposing cuts that would make it harder to modernize our systems. Some of the very same House Republicans who are lining up to try to make the pain of the people of East Palestine, Ohio into a partisan political issue would cut railroad safety inspections. It makes no sense.
President Biden is planning to join the auto workers who are striking. He's going Tuesday to your adopted home state of Michigan. Donald Trump says that President Biden is only going because he had planned to go on Wednesday. Is that part of what's going on here? President Biden trying to draw a contrast?
No, President Biden is doing what he has always done, which is to stand with American workers. He is proud of being the most pro-union, pro-worker president, not only compared to the Trump administration with its anti-union policies, but really compared to any modern president. You're not going to find somebody who has more consistently stood with unions. Now, having said that, it's also the case that these auto companies can thrive in a win-win deal that does what the president has called for, which is to say that record profits should lead to record pay and record benefits for the workers who are creating all that value. And as the auto industry, the global auto industry, moves into the EV future, which, just to be clear, is going to happen no matter what, our goal, and certainly the UAW's goal, is to make sure that that is a made in America EV future where American workers thrive.
I want to ask you about a new Atlantic profile that says that then President Trump complained to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, after an Army veteran who lost a leg in combat sang at the Pentagon, at an event at the Pentagon. Trump reportedly told Milley, quote, "Why do you bring people like that here? No one wants to see that, the wounded." Now, after that article came out, Trump attacked Milley on social media. It was kind of a rambling post, but he suggested that Milley deserved the death penalty. You are a veteran. What's your response?
It's just the latest in a pattern of outrageous attacks on the people who keep this country safe. And September puts me in a reflective mood because it's actually tomorrow, 9 years ago now, that I got back to South Bend after my one tour in Afghanistan. I served with people who did 5, 6, 7 tours, some of them after being injured. I served with a guy who had the fin of a rocket go through his tricep while he was standing he was standing in Ghazni province, and miraculously the rocket didn't blow up and kill him. But he was eager to get back onto his next tour when I got to serve with him. I, in an airport, ran into someone I served with who basically had her leg shut off. And with her new leg, when I ran into her, asked her how she was doing, she said, "The Navy fixed me up just fine," and she went right on to her next assignment. These are the kind of people who deserve respect and a hell of a lot more than that from every American, and definitely from every American president. And the idea that an American president, the person to whom service members look as a commander-in-chief, and the person who sets the tone for this entire country, could think that way or act that way or talk that way about anyone in uniform, and certainly about those who put their bodies on the line and sacrificed in ways that most Americans will never understand. And I guess wounded veterans make President Trump feel uncomfortable. When I encounter somebody who put their body on the line and paid a price for this country, I feel about this big, because I see what they've done, and I see again and again and again their willingness to continue giving. But those are exactly the kinds of people we should lift up, because their commitment could help unify the country. And we need voices, whether it's ordinary people, service members, or political leaders, who are interested in unifying, not dividing Americans.
Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, thank you, and thank you for your service.